It's Wednesday, January 25th, 2023, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, we weren't the only ones talking about the effect of artificial intelligence on news. There are some developments on that front that we're going to talk about. More classified documents found at President Biden's home and now the home of former Vice President Mike Pence. And when a spokesperson speaks in what they call PREs, there's a lot more that I hope we can get to before our time is up today. But first, the documentary that has everyone at the Sundance Film Festival talking. It's called Justice. It's about the sexual abuse allegations against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, focusing primarily on the story of Deborah Ramirez and her allegations about his behavior at a fraternity party at Yale University. Now, I tried to find a trailer for this film and couldn't. From what we've read, what's in the film?
Well, basically what's in the film is it appears to me from everything that you can read, because you can't see it yet, is that they focus in on the stories of these two women who were discussed and brought up at the confirmation hearings because they were part of the FBI investigation. However, it goes into much greater detail about their experiences with Justice Kavanaugh back at Yale, but it also brings out even more information about his days at Yale and apparently the parties that he went to, the fact that he drank a lot and did a whole bunch of other things that didn't come out in the confirmation hearings.
Yeah, well, I think the argument at the time was he was young, right? And this didn't happen recently, but I think this is really, kind of part of the Me Too wave, that it's not okay to behave that way, and so I think no matter how old you are, and I think certainly some people who are from the right kind of upbringing can get away with a lot more than other people can. And I think that's the subtext of the outrage here. So we'll see where it goes. It's interesting. People often forget that the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee when Anita Hill made her accusations against Clarence Thomas. And it was really only a press leak that enabled that to come out, because the senators, and they were all male on that committee then, were ready to just not talk about it because, hey, boys will be boys, you know? Well, if you're not a boy, you have a different attitude towards that. So I think this is a question of, when we talk to our students about wearing blinders, not acknowledging what's happening to other people and how that affects people, not just in the moment, but long term. So if this provokes some conversations, I think that's a good thing.
Go ahead.
Please, no.
No, I was just going to say, part of the issue here for me is where are we now when it comes to Supreme Court nominations and confirmation hearings? Even before you got to Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, I mean, there was, this sort of, we're going to investigate, we're going to put everything out there. But a lot of it actually discussed their legal writings. It discussed what they had done either as appellate judges or as sitting judges in other courts. With that, Bork, Clarence Thomas, Kavanaugh, all the way through, now it's what did you do when you were in college? What did you do throughout your life? What is your personal history? That sort of thing. So it's sort of become, those become the talking points of these confirmation hearings. Not saying that that's wrong, but you could see this sort of change in the way those confirmation hearings go and the investigations that are done.
Right. Well, I agree with you, and I think, and that's why I was saying, I think this is about, it's really not about a Supreme Court justice. This is really about a cultural shift. Is that the right thing to do? I mean, I don't think this means that Justice Kavanaugh is going to be dislodged. He's going to be embarrassed, but But I agree with you that I think we are in this, and this is part of our polarized society, this game of one-upsmanship. You did this to our guy, we're going to do it to your guy. And we are getting to a point where people aren't going to want to be public servants because of that. So it is a real dilemma.
You talk about how he is likely not to be dislodged, just to be embarrassed as a result of this. The film's director is likely familiar to members of our audience. His name is Doug Liman, and he directed The Bourne Identity. He directed Swingers. This is his first documentary. Why move into this genre? Is it about the embarrassment and talking about how these behaviors are not okay? Is it about bringing more stories forward?
I mean, from reading the stories that are out there and his own comments, he watched the confirmation hearings intently. He comes from a legal family. I think it's his father was a lawyer during Iran-Contra. He has a brother who serves on a federal court. So he comes from a family of lawyers and judges and legal scholars. And I think that had something to do with it, but I also think that he was fascinated by, at least from his comments, fascinated by the stories of those who felt as if the Kavanaugh's full story was not brought out there. They had been complaining about this before. They had reached out to the FBI during their investigation and said, "Hey, you need to know about these things," and they felt like that was not their stories were not taken seriously.
Last Friday's premiere is said to be a director's cut. It is not the final version of the film that will go to wide release. And if you go to the website for the film, Justice, you can find that on our links blog. You'll see that all that's on there at this point is an image and information about contacting the directors and producers of this film to be able to relay additional stories.
This is journalism. I mean, documentary film is journalism. And so I think, sometimes real life dramas are better than the ones you make up. And maybe that's what this director is finding out. It's a very journalistic impulse, I think, to try to give voice to people who have been silenced or not acknowledged. So we'll see where it goes.
Okay, well, so while we're talking about one of the justices, it makes sense to bring up some other things that are going on this week with the court. First, a report in the New York Times looking into the investigation into the leak of the Hobbs decision last summer, which overturned Roe versus Wade. What did they find in that piece? What was reported there?
Well, I think what they're trying to do is see if there is a pattern in the decisions, and also if how these leaks happened, which they've kind of walked away from. They're just saying we don't know who did it. Maybe they do know who did it. But I think one of the things I think we're going to see now, and we're even seeing it here in Missouri, is people now bringing cases saying that this violates the Constitution. So I think there's going to be...
The leaking violates.
No, not the leaking. I'm sorry.
Which part?
Thank you for correcting that. The Dobbs decision itself. So I think you're going to see another wave of litigation. Yeah. And even I think to the Federalist Society here, there were some lawyers who spoke and said, this is coming. This is going to be part of the litigation that says it's actually a form of the interesting argument that's going to be made is, does this violate the constitutional prohibition against slavery?
That's interesting.
Yes, because the idea that you would force a woman to carry to term a child, particularly a victim of rape or incest. So, yeah.
That's an interesting take on.
Yeah, no, and that is lawyers talking to the Federalist Society, which is a conservative society. And what I really can't tell is what their take on it is, because they're conservative, but they're also libertarian.
One of the things that was interesting to me about this piece was some of the conversation that it brought up among journalists. Some on social media saying, there needs to be an investigation into the reporting that the journalists are doing into the reporting on the on the SCOTUS's investigation, and maybe those reporters need to be investigated and they need to be subpoenaed and made to give up their sources. And it led to some pretty big fights on social media between journalists saying, what kind of journalist are you? You're selling out another journalist.
Well, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that somewhat, but I think the larger issue here goes back to the fact that you still have one of the three branches of government that is really trying hard to maintain that sort of secrecy that the Supreme Court has always had. Whereas you have much more transparency in the legislative branch, you have much more transparency in the executive branch, and now people are calling for transparency on the judiciary and the Supreme Court in particular, because of what we were talking about earlier. We're not just talking about the legal, we're talking about the personal lives. I mean, when you start talking about the fact that you have Clarence Thomas, whose wife is directly linked to what was going on January 6th. You have documents that show that. You have emails, you have text messages, you have all of that. When you start having it, people are expecting more transparency. Not just journalists, but ordinary, everyday Americans are saying, wait a minute, we need to know more than you're willing to tell us.
Yes, and there's always been a problem with the judges and ethics. Where are they going? I mean, we can go look up where people are traveling if they're a member of Congress, what their outside investments are. The judges have to do some of that, but not all of that. This is a lifetime appointment.
Right.
And so... No, I absolutely agree. It's fair game. I mean, the justices, sometimes we act like the Supreme Court. It looks kind of like a church, and we act like it's the Pope or something, and you can't know anything.
Right.
And so I think, reporters are going to report.
But when you think about it, I mean, the court now has a clear conservative bent. But for several generations, it had what was perceived to be a liberal bent. And you had the same kind of arguments coming out from the conservatives that you're now getting from the liberals about the court. But when you really look at it, when you step back and look at it, a lot of it has to do with the lack of transparency and the lack of, to me, the lack of because of lifetime appointments, the lack of the public to be able to say, wait a minute, we need to have more of a check and balance on the court. Maybe we need to rethink this whole lifetime appointment thing. Because if you can have term limits in some areas...
Is that something you ever see happening?
Never say never.
Yeah.
Never say never. Think about it. I mean,
right.
when we were coming up, you never would have thought that there would be term limits. And now you have term limits in certain areas.
Yeah.
So you never know.
Okay. Well, also on I'm processing that idea for a second. Also on the SCOTUS beat, the court put off making any decisions on state laws that are being challenged in Florida and in Texas on what can or cannot be deleted on social media. One of the things that was interesting to me about this is that they're going to the Biden administration for an interpretation.
Yeah, not so surprising. I mean, it's typical that in a big case, the court will ask for the administration's position. Now, the other thing that is happening, the court has a couple of big internet cases coming up next month. We're still in January, next month. So, and on Section 230, where they're going to be looking at that. And again, they went to the Biden administration. It doesn't matter what administration it is. They're going to ask the Department of Justice to weigh in on what would this do for you in terms of regulation, what's your interpretation of the law. So it's not surprising. It's they often do this. Sometimes the Justice Department weighs in itself, but it'll be really interesting to see where the Justice Department comes down on this.
So I have to say I was not entirely surprised yesterday when the push alerts started. Classified documents found at former Vice President Mike Pence's house. I mean, of course there were documents found at Mike Pence's house after documents were found at Mar-a-Lago and at President Biden's house. How could there not be documents at Pence's house? Which makes me have to ask, is it a story that these documents continue to be found? Or wouldn't you kind of expect it at some point that somebody forgot to return a file with a stamp on it?
I'm not surprised that they're finding documents. I mean, I think if they had been looking for them, they probably would have found documents when President Obama left office.
Okay,
when
so
President
you're saying
Bush
it. I
left
wrote it in the
office.
script, and then I was too chicken to actually say the word. So you're thinking that too.
I think so. I think part of the issue, I think what we're finding out, we didn't know this when the Trump investigation started. But I think part of the problem here is you're having people who are charged by the administration to bring certain materials with the outgoing president and vice president so that they can start gathering materials for their memoirs, for their presidential and vice presidential memoirs, so that they have that material available to be able to write to write their books, which eventually will wind up in their presidential libraries or wherever. That's where I think we're having these issues. What archivists and those at the National Archives would say is, let us bring our people in and help you to do that so that we can make sure that these documents are kept in secure places and you have access to them. That's where I think the story is heading. But because everything is so politicized and the fact that the Trump administration fought it, whereas Pence is not fighting it nor is Biden, now you've got all of these stories that are coming out. And we haven't, the problem I have is that we as journalists aren't thinking in those terms. We're playing gotcha.
It sounds like what
we
you're
got
describing.
Trump, we got Biden, we got Pence, we got,
Well, I think, first of all, it's a question of, well, first of all, on your point, I have actually been at the White House when they were changing administrations.
And they've, like an hour and a half to do it or whatever?
Think about this. You have people who are in charge of keeping the country safe. And at 12:01, we just switch, vavoom.
Right.
And there are cases, there's a great book by a guy named Gary Sick who worked for President Carter. They were negotiating the Iran hostage crisis till the last minute. And so there's a lot going on. And think about yourselves when you move. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, that's where I put this teacup. Mm-hmm. So some of it is innocent. And it's not good, and I agree with you that archivists should be more intimately involved. But these are executive types who don't like to be told what to do. I think that's going to change. But there is a big, big difference between Joe Biden and Mike Pence volunteering, hey, I found this, with this going on, I did a search, I found it, here it is, and somebody who, in Trump's case, the archives knew they were missing documents and had to hound him to get them back and get a court order. So that is the big difference. So I think, to your point about gotcha, I think anything that suggests there's an equivalence here is wrong. And in terms of over coverage, that suggests an equivalence too.
Right.
So it's the time spent on these stories that are insignificant to the American people, really.
And that's the point that I'm making. Is that
agree? It's boring.
After a while, the significance of Trump loses. You lose something there because it all starts to sound the same. It all seems to come across the same, and the public
100%.
at some point goes,
yes.
"Wait a minute, we have natural disasters going on the Gulf Coast, the West Coast, the East Coast. We've got mass shootings going on. We've got
eggs are $6 a dozen.
We got inflation going on. We got a possible recession. We got all this going on, and y'all worried about some documents.
Well,
really?
and so another part that's interesting, and you can read about this on our links blog too. It's starting to bubble up in the media trades that the journalists who are making some of those false equivalencies are getting quite frustrated with the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, and saying that she's not giving them good enough information. She's not taking their questions seriously enough. And that she is the most incompetent White House press secretary of all time, parenthetically excluding the Trump administration. Like literally the claims were saying that. At the same time though, and Kathy, this made me think about a column you had shared with me about 10 days ago from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about what's called PREs. The idea of that public information officer, that spokesperson, giving an answer that is a non-answer to something that is perhaps a non-story, so as to give comment, and whether or not those comments should or need to be included in reporting just because we have them.
Yeah, I think I love that column because the St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist said he's never going to run that kind of stuff again, and I thought that was great because and I think this gets to some of the White House, because of course the White House press secretaries are masters at this, is putting out these word salads that are calorie-free or substance-free, and that's what the column is all about. And I, as a journalist and a journalism teacher, I'm going to recommend that to my students. If it's a bunch of air that's meaningless, like cotton candy, it's all puffed up, but it doesn't really mean anything, don't quote them.
So here's my question and how we get around that. We talk about transparency. That PREs, as useless as some of it might be, it demonstrates, at least to the audience, that we asked a question. We sought that comment. It's not as though we would be able to say that they didn't provide a comment. They provided one. It was just we didn't deem it worthy of putting in the story. Well, I think that's a good point. How do we write to that?
Well, you can. I think it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
But I think very limit what they say. And I think it's okay to characterize it as a non-answer answer. I think we also have to be better about following up and saying, well, what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Exactly. Which is something I bring up all the time.
You didn't find any documents? Does that mean, when did you turn them over?
Yeah.
Really get
push
specific.
harder for clarification.
Yes, exactly.
And that's one of the things that I think that I see as a problem with our journalism, and a lot of it has to do with we're always trying to make a deadline. I mean, it's not like you're making a deadline for the evening news.
Right. It's almost like we don't even have deadlines anymore because it's now.
You got to get it up, and so whatever statement happens to come out, I'm going to go with this because then I'm able to meet my deadline. Whereas you should stop and go like, wait a minute, you just said this, but that didn't really answer my question. What did you mean by this? And push a little bit harder to get that information. And then if you don't get it, then you stand on much more solid ground to say the administration provided this, but it didn't really answer the question and get to the point of what's actually going on.
Well, and can I just say one thing about the White House press corps? Please. It's Mike McCurry, who was the press secretary for Bill Clinton, has said publicly numerous times the worst decision he ever made was televising the press briefings. And I think most reporters would agree with that, although they wouldn't say so publicly, because it has become a grandstanding thing, and the reporters could do a better job if they followed up on each other's questions. But no, their bosses have told them, make sure you get this question in, or make sure you get that question in, or they have a story that they want to preen about. And I think it behooves us as journalists to put the ego to one side. As the great Jim Lehrer always used to say, it's not about you. Yeah. And follow up on your colleague's question if you feel like the press secretary isn't giving you an answer. The press secretary's job is to make the boss look good, and your job is to find out things.
Exactly.
So
I mean, why
follow
that's
up on
the thing
each other.
that bugs me is why do you want to get mad at the press secretary for doing exactly what Kathy just said, which is trying to make her boss look good and to make sure that whatever comes out isn't too harmful to him or her, right?
I mean, that's literally what their job is.
That's literally what their job is. And then you want to go after them and say, well, they're the worst, blah, 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 blah. Well, they're doing their job. You're mad because they're pretty good at it.
Maybe you're the worst.
That's...
Maybe you're the one that's the worst. I'd like to see, and I realize we play a huge role in this, that our student journalists break out of some of the generational traps that have been built in there of, well, I emailed them, they emailed me back this statement, I have it, that's all I have. Where we're not having those opportunities and they're not as assertive in asking some of those follow-up questions. And so I know that's something we are working on here with the implementation of some news conferences at some of our courses on the lower level where students are getting some of that practice and listening to what other students are asking of spokespeople in our area here to try and do that and to be a little bit better about that. Quickly, I want to talk about something we talked about last week as well, the rise of artificial intelligence in CNET, that tech publication that was using it to publish a whole bunch of evergreen content. They have since stopped that. And Futurist, the publication that had been doing a lot of the reporting around this, pointed out that there was actually some plagiarism that was found because the robot that was crawling the internet to write the content was rewriting and not attributing to the original content.
Really? I wonder who wrote that code in the program.
One of the things, though, that is somewhat exciting about this is we are hearing about other newsrooms across the country sitting down and having some real conversations about this and how artificial intelligence is factoring into their work. Before we go today, I want to take a minute to recognize a member of the Mid-Missouri television news family that few at home ever knew. But this person's impact has been felt in this community and across Mid-Missouri for decades. Roger Albee died earlier this week. He worked at KOMU TV for 65 years, joining the staff there in 1957. He worked as a director, a camera operator, a floor director. In fact, I did not know until recently that he had actually retired before I was working out at KOMU in 1997 and came back from retirement to be working until just a few weeks ago. Staffers there are remembering him for his fantastic smile, his calming nature, and his genuine interest in everyone with whom he crossed paths. And one of the reasons I really wanted to bring this up and talk about this and talk about Roger is the idea that people at home connect very quickly and very easily with the people they see on their TVs every day. We're talking about somebody who had a direct impact on what they were seeing on TV for nearly 70 years. And the people behind the scenes are very easily overlooked.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because you're starting to see a lot of that generation either, some pass away, some retire. Both nationally and locally, and it's the interesting part to that is that they bring that sort of human element to it that a lot of people don't see, but they make the people who are in front of the camera look the way they do and be able to do the things that they do, but they get very little recognition. And the interesting part is that many of them are being replaced by, we just got to talk about AI, many of them are getting replaced by robots and by cameras that are not operated by humans. So, but I think that human element is going to be missing there.
I think it's really important because it's not just, as Amy pointed out, this is a very high-stress business.
Yeah.
And it's people behind the scenes who have that personality to sort of keep everybody calm. I know when I hired for a newsroom, I always looked for that kind of person who was going to be the leavening to keep the newsroom operating, because without them, you can't do it.
Yeah.
And that director, that person who is back there, and you can see Travis behind us now, they're the ones that when things get weird, or they're the ones that are making sure you have the right camera or getting the right person off, closing their microphone when they start coughing or whatever that might be. Well, we are pretty much out of time for this week. Thank you for spending your last half hour with us. Read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's under the programs and the podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave comments or questions, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Thanks to Travis McMillan for directing today's show, to Kia Thomas for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed that theme music.